Devion Arsajano. Today, we will talk about a story that tests the very limits of human endurance, a story of survival against all odds. Imagine, if you will, the date, October 13th, 1972. A plane carrying a young rugby team, their friends and their family, soars over the magnificent but treacherous Andes Mountains. Suddenly, a terrible mistake, a deafening sound of tearing metal, and the world turns upside down. The plane crashes, and in an instant, a journey of hope becomes a scene of utter devastation. 12 souls are lost immediately, and the survivors find themselves stranded in a frozen, silent wasteland, thousands of meters above the world, with nothing but wreckage and the biting cold for company. The first days were a blur of shock, pain, and disbelief. The survivors, many of them just young men, were surrounded by the bodies of their friends and loved ones. Injuries were severe. Broken bones, deep wounds, and internal bleeding were common. Two medical students, Roberto Canessa and Gustavo Zerbino, did what they could with no supplies, their courage shining in the face of overwhelming despair. At night, the temperatures plummeted to unimaginable lows, forcing the survivors to huddle together inside the broken fuselage of the plane. They packed the open end of the aircraft with luggage to block the freezing wind, a small fortress against the unforgiving mountain that held them captive. Survival in this white hell was a minute-by-minute battle. The initial food supply was laughably small, a few chocolate bars, some crackers, and a handful of wine bottles. They rationed these meager supplies with extreme care, each small bite a precious treasure. Hunger was a constant, gnawing companion, but an even greater enemy was the cold. Their city clothes were no match for the alpine environment. Frostbite began to set in, and the blinding glare of the sun on the snow threatened to steal their sight. They had to learn to survive in a world they were never meant to inhabit, a world where every sunrise was a small victory against death itself. In those early weeks, hope was pinned on one thing: rescue. They were certain that the world was looking for them, that soon they would hear the roar of helicopters coming to take them home. They found a small transistor radio, and it became their only link to the outside world, a lifeline of hope. Every day, they would listen, desperate for news of the search efforts. The thought of their families, waiting and praying for them, is what kept their spirits from completely shattering. They believed with all their hearts that their ordeal would soon be over. But the mountains are vast, and the white snow had swallowed their white plane, making it nearly invisible from the sky. As days turned into a week, and then another, the initial shock gave way to a grim, terrifying reality. The mountain was not a temporary prison. It was becoming their tomb. The small transistor radio, which had been their source of hope, delivered the most crushing blow of all. On the 10th day, they heard the news they had been dreading. The search for Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 had been officially called off. The world had given them up for dead. Imagine the silence that must have fallen over that broken fuselage. The hope that had fueled them was extinguished in an instant, replaced by an abyss of absolute despair. They were truly, completely alone. Faced with this soul-crushing news, the survivors confronted a terrible choice. Their meager food supply was gone. Starvation was no longer a threat. It was a certainty. It was then that they made a pact, a decision so difficult that it is hard for us to even comprehend. They decided that to live, they would have to consume the bodies of their deceased friends who lay preserved in the snow. It was a pact born of desperation, a sacred promise that if they should die, their own bodies could be used to sustain the others. This act, they reasoned, was the ultimate communion, a final act of giving so that their friends might have a chance to see their own families again. The mountain was not finished with them yet. On the 17th day of their ordeal, as they slept, a new horror descended. An avalanche, a silent, white monster, crashed down upon the fuselage, burying it completely in snow. The disaster struck with terrifying speed, filling the cramped space and suffocating 8 more of the survivors. For 3 long days, the remaining 19 were trapped in the darkness, entombed under the snow, with barely enough air to breathe. They had to claw their way out, digging a tunnel to the surface, emerging back into a world that seemed determined to destroy them at every turn. The avalanche, while a tragedy, ironically provided a temporary solution to their food crisis, but it deepened their psychological scars. The daily routine became a grim ritual of survival. They devised a system to melt snow into water, using pieces of metal from the plain. They assigned tasks, trying to maintain a semblance of order in the chaos. Yet, with each passing day, their bodies grew weaker. Sickness, infection, and the unrelenting mental toll began to claim more lives. They understood that waiting for a miracle was no longer an option. If they were to survive, they could not wait for help to find them. They would have to go and find help themselves. The realization that they must walk out of the mountains was both terrifying and liberating. It gave them a purpose beyond just surviving another day. But who could possibly make such a journey? They chose the strongest among them, Nando Parado, who had lost his mother and sister in the crash and was fueled by a fierce desire to escape, Roberto Canessa, the medical student, and Antonio Tintin Vizintin. These three were designated as the expeditionaries. They were given larger food rations and the warmest clothes they could fashion from the luggage of the dead, preparing their bodies and minds for the impossible trek that lay ahead. Their first major expedition was not to find civilization, but to find the tail section of the aircraft. The pilots had mentioned before the crash that the plane's batteries were in the tail. The survivors reasoned that if they could find the tail, they might find these batteries and use them to power the cockpit radio and send an SOS message. On November 15th, after weeks of planning and waiting for a break in the weather, the three men set out. The journey was perilous, a slow and exhausting march through deep snow at high altitude, a landscape that offered no mercy and no landmarks. After a grueling trek, they found it. About a mile from the fuselage, lying like a broken toy, was the tail section of the plane. The discovery was a moment of immense excitement and renewed hope. Inside, they found a treasure trove that must have felt like a miracle. There was luggage containing clean clothes, comic books, a little bit of food, including chocolate and rum, and most importantly, the batteries. They spent a night sheltered in the tail section, a brief respite from the wind, their spirits lifted by the find. For a moment, it seemed as if their desperate plan might actually work. With the batteries located, the next phase of the plan began. The batteries were far too heavy to carry back to the fuselage through the deep snow and up the mountain. So, they made a logical, yet ultimately doomed decision. They would bring the radio to the batteries. Roy Harley, who had some amateur electronics experience, was brought to the tail section to help. For several days, he and the others worked tirelessly, trying to connect the radio to the batteries, their frozen fingers fumbling with the wires. But they were unaware of a fatal technical flaw. The plane's radio required AC power, and the batteries supplied only DC power. The radio would never work. The plan had failed. The failure of the radio plan was another devastating blow. It was the final confirmation that technology and luck were not going to save them. As they returned to the fuselage, defeated, the group's physical and mental state was at its lowest point. The mountain continued to claim its victims. Arturo Nogueira succumbed to his infected leg wounds. Then, Rafael Echavarren passed away. The final death at the crash site was that of Numa Turcati, a young man of incredible spirit who had resisted the pact of cannibalism for as long as he could. His passing on December 11th, the 60th day, was a clear signal to the rest: leave now or die here. On December 12th, Nando Parado and Roberto Canessa set out on their final, desperate expedition, this time heading west towards Chile. They knew that this was not a scouting mission. It was a walk to life or a walk to their deaths. There would be no turning back. Antonio Vizintin went with them initially to carry a share of the meager food supplies. After climbing a massive peak, a journey that took them 3 days, they were met with a heartbreaking sight. Not the green valleys of Chile they had dreamed of, but an endless sea of more snow-capped mountains. In that moment of despair, Parado's resolve hardened. He told Canessa, "We may be walking to our deaths, but I would rather walk to meet my death than wait for it to come to me." They made a critical decision. They sent Visintin back to the fuselage with the remaining supplies so that the two of them could travel lighter and faster, and so the others could survive a little longer. For another 8 days, Parado and Canessa walked. They descended from the snowline, their bodies emaciated, their minds pushed to the breaking point. They finally saw signs of life, some greenery, the tracks of an animal, and then a river. On the other side of that river, they saw a man on a horse, a Chilean farmer named Sergio Catalan. Barely able to speak, Parado threw a note tied to a rock across the river, explaining who they were. The farmer understood. That simple act of human connection marked the end of their 72-day ordeal. On December 22, 1972, the world was stunned to learn that 16 survivors of Flight 571 were alive. Helicopters flew into the mountains and brought them back to a world that had long since forgotten them. Their story is more than just a tale of survival. It is a powerful testament to the unbreakable human spirit, to courage, and to the will to live against all odds. It teaches us that even in the darkest of times, when all hope seems lost, we must never, ever give up. If this story of human resilience has moved you, please share it, so that others may also find inspiration in their incredible journey. And for more such stories, do subscribe. Thank you.